Hey everyone. The nice thing about going last is that I get to reference everyone else's talk, and it looks like we coordinated ahead of time. I look extra prepared. If you don't mind, if we could switch the slide here. It's this, right? Okay, great. How do you define design? What's good design to you? If you don't know what this picture is, this is Earthrise. If this is your first space conference, like I think a couple of you said this morning, it was your first SGAC event, and you don't know this picture, you should remember it, because you will never stop seeing it in this industry. 35 years ago, 2 decades after Apollo 8 astronaut Bill Anders took this photo, there was a writer named Frank White, and he coined the phrase the overview effect, which Alvin was kind enough to set up for me earlier today. Pulling from dozens of interviews with astronauts, Frank White described this phenomenon as a cognitive shift. It happens in the minds of astronauts as they viewed this, the Earth from space, shimmering, vast, and borderless. They recounted to him a sweeping emotional experience bordering on the spiritual, where their outlook on themselves, the world, and the future was called into very stark question. By gaining this literal physical perspective over the Earth, they were moved to re-examine their own space, their own position among their fellow Earth dwellers, and all the biodiversity that's housed in our incredible home. So for many of them, this sudden feeling of sudden realization was closely followed by a spark of drive, a rush to action, to use this newfound understanding to better serve their fellow humans. Something similar to this effect happens right here on Earth all the time. There's a problem out there in the world, you're aware of it, but, doesn't necessarily affect you personally, so in the hustle and bustle of everything, you don't really pay much attention to it until all of a sudden, something happens to happen. And now the situation has changed because it does affect you personally. It may be you directly, it may be someone close to you that you love very much. Either way, it's only then that it becomes real to you and you feel compelled to act. And don't get me wrong, I'm not knocking Frank White, I'm not knocking Alvin's amazing talk earlier today. The overview effect can be a really great thing. And allowing more people to experience this firsthand is one of the biggest allures of lowering the barriers to human spaceflight that are in place today. But I'd like to challenge us this afternoon to close out this amazing day, just for a few minutes to think about this effect, this phenomenon, in another way. And to do that, I'm going to talk about risk. Most of my job is centered around risk. In the context of space operations and how we use Earth orbit for the benefit of future generations, in this space renaissance, my work theorizes how we should be thinking about risk to safeguard this orbit in a more sustainable way. I work very hard to bring in expertise from all sorts of fields, not just space, to figure out how we should even be conceptualizing of risk in the first place, how to identify and measure its components, what we can do to control it, how we can verify those controls, how to control for what we don't know or what we're not great at measuring yet. Once we have a passing grasp on those things, the design work can really begin. But risk also plays a role in my personal life. Like a lot of us, this was drawn into very stark relief over the past 2 years. I think we can all agree. And even now, when I look across this room, especially people, who I haven't seen in 2 years, my community that I've longed to be back with for so long, I find myself still with mixed feelings. There's a not so small part of me that just can't brush aside the people who aren't in this room, who couldn't take the risk of attending an event like this out of concern for their health. And I would be lying if I said I didn't miss them very much and wish that they could join. Across both science and sociology, one thing is very clear about us as a species, and that's that collectively, before we get a chance to learn from each other at least, we tend to have a pretty abysmal internal gauge of risk. How we perceive risk is affected by all sorts of things, and they can turn at the drop of a hat. And it's part of why we put our trust in things like statistics and trends, analysis of the past, to help make sense of the world, rather than solely on personal anecdotes and personalities. But what's even more curious is that the risks that people feel they can control, ourselves, are perceived as more acceptable than risks controlled by external forces. This is true even when that doesn't really line up with the actual risk of a situation. For example, there are plenty more people in this world who have a fear of flying in a passenger airplane that's piloted by somebody else than people who have fears of riding a bike or driving a car. But if we look statistically on the aggregate, is something like, for example, not wearing a mask to a conference really as risky as riding a bike? What if you're riding a bike in downtown DC during rush hour traffic, during cherry blossom season? What about if you're riding in the winter? What about going for a jog by yourself after sundown? What about using a public restroom that matches your gender? What about going to a protest? I think you can see where I'm going with this. The reality is that regardless of how we perceive it, risk isn't distributed equally, at least not right now. It's dynamic, and it's dynamic often in ways that even statistics fail to fully measure, fully capture. No human yet has ever moved through this world as a blank slate, removed from their identity and their culture, and in my opinion, no one ever should. But what does this mean for trying to create a better world? From a design standpoint, I think this means that the most correct answers to many design questions will always be, very frustratingly, it depends. The systems and institutions that we've inherited or are going on to inherit as young professionals are full of faults. They're full of very bad design. Design that originated and is perpetuated as exclusively as possible in its consideration of risk. And some systems are more entrenched than others. But what they all have in common is that they share a reliance on us, people. Our effort, our knowledge, our hard work, our cooperation, and in some cases, our ignorance. So, if you ask me, the one good thing that we mere mortals have going for us is that no matter what happens, we maintain our ability to tailor our actions based on new information that comes along our way. In short, we can iterate, and design starts to look more like this. Will's second point in his talk kind of stole this idea, but no, it's fine. There's one element here that I want you to walk away with, and that's that this can't happen unless information doesn't just get to us, that it gets through to us. Oh God, that was horrible. I'm so sorry. That it gets through to us. It depends on not waiting for a problem to be personal to us, for that spark of being driven into action to take hold. It depends on information not being overlooked. So however you personally define design, however you approach it in your work or in your personal life, we all understand that controlling risk in its entirety is impossible. And for that, you can blame whatever you want. Human nature, statistics, physics. But whether you're here now in this room or listening to this in the future, I do want you to know that our lives and our choices are connected, that no action exists in isolation, and that we play a role in the iterative, continual design of the world around us, everywhere we go. By now, hopefully, you've heard enough times that you don't need to have a technical background to find a place in the space industry. I'm here to tell you that you also don't need to be poorly affected by the poor design that you see around you to take a stand and try to remedy it. If nothing else, through our influence on the lives of the people around us, we can't let each other wait for a spark. Thank you very much.